Right. The fear I usually have with talks like this is that I bottle people with bullshit. So I'm going to try and skip as much of the bullshit as possible and keep it as simple as possible so that we can talk more later and talk a lot we need to do around some of this stuff. We've seen these kinds of slides before, the importance of peatlands and how vast they are, how extensive they are, but also how important Ireland is in particular for peatlands. Not least in terms of the coverage we have, but also in terms of the quality, believe it or not, that we still have in Ireland versus other countries. So we have a massive opportunity and also I think a massive responsibility, all of us in this room and elsewhere, to conserve as much of that as possible. My training is in conservation biology, so that's the reason I am doing this. The way we get there often needs to involve money, it needs to involve people in particular, it needs to involve science and knowledge. But ultimately my goal is conservation biology. The nature of our peatlands in Ireland is Elena here. I think I saw her earlier. Elena, here. Yeah, hello. I referenced her again. Thank you. Okay, so fantastic study done recently to collate all of the existing knowledge in terms of the peatlands we have in Ireland, what's on top of them, what condition they are in, and again, those opportunities that emerge from those figures. Globally speaking, we spend a lot on biodiversity, but we don't spend anywhere near what we need to spend or anywhere near what we should spend in terms of what it gives us back in terms of the services. Now there's big figures there, very, very large, B's and T's here. And in reality, Ireland can work in those figures in B's and T's. A recent assessment of this, the Resource Mobilisation Special Session, found that inaction on this costs the global economy $500 billion every single year because we don't take enough action. We don't spend enough money to get even more back. And that's not just in terms of the carbon and the water and the biodiversity, you can put a figure or not, but also in terms of the softer stuff, the community engagement, the community benefit, the social good, the spirituality associated with that, even the well-being that you possibly can put a figure on in terms of healthcare. You can put a euro based on the amount spent in hospital or the lifespan. So there are particular ways of capitalising on this, but sometimes there aren't. The lay of the land in Ireland, I've gone all Mac. Lots of different players involved in Ireland, and awful lots of different programs involved in spending the money on peatlands in Ireland. A few years ago we were looking at 60 or 70 million every single year on peatlands. We're now likely up to the €100 million mark every single year spent on peatlands in various different projects through various different streams. And for the majority, most of these are aimed at healthy habitats, communities and climate, and that's great. Admirable aspiration towards that middle box there, which is fantastic. There's other aspirations as well if you look at the corporates in terms of the risks associated with how they operate. The financial risk, is it going to cost us money? Is it already costing us money? The reputational risk, is it going to hurt how people perceive us and how they actually buy our stuff if they do? Or the transitional risk, are we going to be forced to change in the near or medium term? And how do we act to counter that, maybe even forecast that? So there's various different drivers for this. However, thus far, most of that stops there. There's a brown line there. Because there's very, very little cost thus far on any returns from the services that we are generating from this. Now again, some of it is more clear cut in terms of emissions, so carbon and nitrates and methane, and the biodiversity, which is very, very important, not least in terms of the government bodies that have an obligation or a responsibility to protect, but also many, many others who want to do it, not because they're obliged to. Communities and all the various services and important parts of that are often, if not always, forgotten in these conversations. And then the water stuff, which is extremely important. Again, we drink it, but also it flows through our farmland. It flows unwittingly through our villages, oftentimes we don't want it, and there are ways of minimising that. And there are ways of capitalising on that. If we want to, through the cold clinical market system, and we talked about that, and Neil alluded to that as well, in terms of carbon, but also in terms of water. There's an emerging and increasingly strong water market from peatlands, or wetlands in general. There's also the cost of compliance associated with this. So, as I said, lots of government bodies and others have obligations, and at the moment they are paying fines because they're not adhering to those obligations. So there is a direct cost you can associate with that. If we conserve this in this area or get somebody else to conserve that, well, they saved us money on tomorrow's fine or on our own costs of restoring that area or protecting it at least. There's a cost of treatment and prevention, more specifically in terms of water. So yes, it floods, and if we can lower the cost of that through the Office of Public Works or others, Ishka Éireann or Irish Water as they were, And the cost of treatment of that, millions and millions spent every single year taking just the colour out of our water. Perfectly potable water, but because it looks like tea, we don't want it. So they spend millions zapping it with electricity or even passing it through other things to get that colour out. Peatlands naturally have done that very, very well for millions and millions of years. Well, certainly thousands of them. And then also the community. So, the well-being benefits, the rural employment, the placemaking, both past, present and future associated with all of this, oftentimes become always forgotten, or at least minimised in these conversations. The whole point of this is to do that very simple arrow back into this. So it can generate returns to do all of the middle stuff even better. Do it further, do it better, do it across wider areas, do it for longer, or make it last longer at the very least. And this is where one of these projects comes in. So Peatland Finance Ireland, and the general objective is to establish and ensure the management of a national and catchment scale financing system for peatland restoration. That's the bullshit part. And it gets more bullshit. The principles of this, and we have talked through these principles and we need to make sure they're clear, and they are by no means set in stone, and there are conversations we had to fine tune them, but mainly is to look at the multiple benefits of landscapes and people, generating resilient blended finance, both in terms of sustainability economically and financially, making sure that there's an equitable structure that emerges from this, in terms of benefits for landowners and small beneficiaries, and that they come first. That it adheres to the just transition principles for both alternative incomes and for fuel sources. That there is transparency and integrity in what we do, in terms of the openness of our findings, and where correct and feasible. That it is not for profit, absolutely fundamental here. That we reinvest any of those proceeds, that big green arrow, back into the middle box there, back into the landscapes of the people. That there is scientific excellence in this, both in terms of the monitoring, the verification of this, and the claims made around this. That it is independent and has broad governance, both representative and ensures that there's equal voices across all of those. Stakeholder advisory services should be provided from this, both in terms of modes of entering the schemes and in just general knowledge. How does it work? What should it do? Is it doing that? And then last, that there is independent verification of both the results and the outcomes, so that it can't be held by a singular, potentially vested interest, and that includes a government agency. Being held by sole government is just as vested, I suppose, as anything else. So it does need to have that broad push. It began way back in July 2020 with an online meeting, as everything was back then, and backing our bogs, financing peatland restoration, much like this kind of meeting. We brought in as many different stakeholders as we could, and the general output of that was that there was common limitations, but also solutions associated with this. That we needed to consider community views much, much more, that there were firmer mechanisms of representation required, but that expertise from the financial realm were absolutely essential to any of this. And I don't have that either. We have found some, but not all of it. The development of this went further, so we got initial seed funding and continue to use that from the European Investment Bank and their Natural Capital Finance Facility. Again, one of those intimidating words. As soon as anything is labelled with natural capital, people get quite cynical about it and think, well, you're just putting a euro symbol on something, you're not really valuing it. And that's not always the case. National Parks and Wildlife Service continue to support it as well, through their Science and Biodiversity Unit. And then also, it now closely marries up with the Waterlands project that Neil talked about. So very, very large, linked in with big EU networks, but also great knowledge source to feed back into Ireland as well. I won't go through the deliverables of that, they're all really boring, but suffice to say, we did produce documents that did say quite detailed things about how we could capitalise on this, mainly in terms of the carbon and the water that could come from this. Again, not going to get into the real detail of this, but we developed a strong man for blended finance from this. So what all the kinds of fancy arrows and fancy boxes, there was carbon funds in the centre. The simplistic version of this is, again, we've got a Mac here and we can still read it, is to combine finance streams, so that's blended finance, from both public investments, which is the majority at the moment, 97% at the moment is public top-down from either national or EU sources, but also carbon credits, emerging markets in this, which can do massive amounts of good, and then commercial finance too, for whatever those different risk categories I spoke about earlier are. That feeds into four predominant case study or pilot pathways, which are post-energy, I say energy, but mainly post-energy, forests, water and agriculture. Now, there's complexity associated with all four of those. not easy to resolve, some of them. They deliver integrated results in terms of carbon, water, biodiversity and livelihoods. Again, not an easy thing. The purpose being, though, that if you can stack these, what you get from them is greater than the sum of their parts. So yes, carbon, you get a value from that. Water credit, there may soon be a value for that. Biodiversity credits, they are emergent. If you want to Google the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, that's a reasonably good model. And then also livelihoods, so broader, socially engaged, maybe even a social credit, social impact credit. And again, there are models elsewhere that we could apply here too. Importantly, in Ireland, that needs to operate at a catchment and in particular national scale. Because the trust required for very large investors needs that embedding in national policy. Operating on a case-by-case, small project level, especially if it's for 2 or 5 years, simply won't work, especially if you look at the additionality and the permanence required for some of these measures to stick. Other regulatory linkages, there's lots of them. I mean, we know about some of them already. Some of them are emergent, some of them might never come to pass. Get to them in a second. But there's existing ones like the biodiversity strategy, the Green Deal, lots of other environmental directives, like birds and habitats and nitrates and all the other important stuff that we do need to adhere to. There's land use change in forestry, LUCF, if you know. And then there's the emissions obligations that we have, which we are nowhere near hitting, if you look at the recent EPA report. But also, the more technical financial stuff, which actually does drive the markets towards what we're trying to do here. So they're going to meet us in the middle, out of necessity, through these bullet points at the bottom here. Through the non-financial reporting directive, the task force for nature-related financial disclosures, so they now have to report on the impacts they're having on nature, not just on the economics, not just on their books in the background somewhere. And also the EU taxonomy. Increasingly companies, very, very large companies, and even governments are being asked, are you aligned? Are you aligned with that EU taxonomy there? Is your spending, are your supply chains aligned with the regulations of the EU? And that goes beyond the EU. It's not just within a company based in Europe, it's where they get their products from. Whether they get rubber from Malaysia or nuts from Mozambique, whatever it is. They need to ensure that they are trustworthy and that they can stand behind them. And that feeds into what we're trying to do here. And then the bottom one, the nature restoration law, which is in trouble at the moment. It is ambitious. It is maybe somewhat idealistic, and that's why there's so much pushback from it. That's in the Parliament at the moment, and Neil can say a lot more about this, I'm sure. But it will be a struggle to get through that level of ambition. Nevertheless, it feeds into exactly what we're trying to do here, and has implications, which are wider ranging. At the moment, the progress of Peatland Finance Ireland towards this, we've got steering, advisory, and implementation groups being established right now. We now give reference to in Ireland's climate action plan, so PFI is now a goal, 41 or 42 of our climate action plan. So we now have a national level legitimacy that is really important. We are completely limited by guarantee, so that allows us to operate in terms of receiving funds, dispersing those to projects on the ground. We're sourcing continued funding, and that's some of which is secured. There's development for other streams as well, and we're consolidating that. We've got these in-depth development pathways underway, and ground floor investors are now starting to enter, or at least are talking to us about how they can enter. And we can be very cautious about who we talk to and how we allow those players in, not least in terms of what they claim or what they aim to get from this. And we can hold the narrative on it. We can hold who gets in and who gets out. It's not up to them, which is important. We also have funding secured to develop and test a Peatland standard for Ireland. So that's supported, or will be supported by the IEC and the UK's Peatland programme. Note in bold, we're not just adopting the UK's code here. As was said earlier, it may be one of the closer ones, but it's not the be-all and end-all. We will need to learn from other models elsewhere, in Europe or further afield, if needed. Community involvement is really important here. So we need better and broader involvement necessary from all community interests. We've been bad at that to date. We need to respect legitimate fears, and there are many out there, and we need to listen to them better. We need to improve communications on what this means, and also what it doesn't mean, which often isn't said. This monitoring, reporting, and verification, that can be costly, so funds are required to support that on the ground, like Neil talked about in his table there. So grant support for initial steps of that. And then maybe coordinate small loans or microfinance to these community groups to move it forward even further and enter the market if we wish. The big questions that I'll leave you with before I finish. First of all, do I want this? That's really important for community groups. It's a big first one. If so, what do I want this to look like? Because it is in your interest to help design this as well. What are we not doing thus far in terms of our thinking? Who is also not here? That should be. And the last one, which is possibly the trickiest one, who do I not trust and why? And that's a really, really tricky one. It's hard to articulate sometimes, even if you just think about it internally. Where are my blockages in this? How can I get over them? Do I need to? Should I not? Who do I need to engage with this? And when do I start that conversation? Or how do I start that conversation? Maybe over the coffee break. I'll stop there and pass the mic.
Thanks very much.